Good evening, all, and welcome back to Erie Hour. Tonight, we are heading into the frozen depths of America's last frontier with 10 of the most unsettling true Alaskan ghost town horror stories. These are not fairy tales or old legends passed down through families. These are real accounts pulled from police files, old journals, survivor statements, and government documents that have been hidden away for decades. From the creature-haunted ruins of Portlock, where a whole town vanished in fear, to the icy graves of Kakot, where corporate secrets still rest frozen in the ground. Every story tonight is a piece of chilling truth that officials never wanted revealed. We will uncover mining accidents that were intentionally hidden, government projects that failed in terrifying ways, and encounters with forces that pushed entire towns to leave behind everything they had built in these isolated places. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Eerie Hour for daily true horror stories that will leave you wondering what really happens when people try to survive against the wild. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when the shadows call. And if you want to help me keep digging up these lost stories, you can buy me a coffee using the link in the description. Now let us move into the frozen nightmares of Alaska's ghost towns, where the cold is deadly, but the truth is far worse. I am reading this from a journal I bought at an estate sale in Anchorage. The seller told me it had belonged to her grandfather, Marcus Beaumont, one of the last men to live in Portlock. She refused to say much about why she was selling his belongings. But once I opened the old leather book and saw the first entry dated March 15th, 1949, I understood why she could not bear to keep it in her home. Marcus Beaumont had beautiful penmanship, the type schools taught in the early 1900s. His first pages were normal enough, filled with complaints about the weather, comments on the salmon run, and thoughts about neighbors in what was then a thriving fishing town at the southern end of the Kenai Peninsula. But as I read further, the writing began to change. His style grew rushed, uneasy, and what he wrote down would disturb anyone who came across it. The first strange entry was dated April 2nd, 1949. Marcus wrote, "Something has been standing at the tree line watching the town for 3 days. Old Peter Vasnikov spotted it first, nearly 8 feet tall, covered in black hair, just beyond the cannery. When Peter yelled at it, the figure vanished so quickly it was as if it had never been there. But Peter swore he saw glowing yellow eyes staring back, studying us in a way we could never understand. I spent months researching the true story of Portlock, and what I discovered in government records did not line up with what Marcus wrote in his journal. Official accounts claim Portlock slowly emptied because of money troubles and the new Sterling Highway, which made other places easier to reach. Records show the post office closed around 1950 or 1951, and families moved away to nearby villages like Nanwalek and Port Graham. But Marcus's writing reveals something very different. April 8th, 1949. Jimmy Hobson went out hunting one morning and never came back. Normally, this would not be strange, except Jimmy knew those woods better than anyone. He was tracking a moose by the creek near the ruins of an old Russian church when his wife Mary heard a scream. It was not a shout for help, but a cry of pure fear that rang across the mountains for minutes. 2 days later, the search team found his rifle bent in half like someone had folded it like paper. There was no trace of Jimmy anywhere. The rest of April's entries grew more desperate. Marcus wrote about 3 more people disappearing within only 2 weeks. Each search found signs of fights, ripped clothes, broken gear, torn ground, but never a body. What they did find were tracks. April 20th, 1949. The tracks are all over now. They are 18 inches long, sunk deep into the earth, showing 5 toes and marks like claws. Thomas Larson measured them and said, Whoever made these must weigh at least 600 pounds and walk on two legs, but no man has feet like this, and no bear leaves prints like this. The elders called it Ninak, the old Alayat word for the hairy one who takes people. They said their grandparents used to warn about this thing, but I always thought those were just scary tales to keep kids from wandering off. What Marcus wrote matches other stories I found, but with details no official report ever included. The creature was not just taking people, it was watching, learning the ways of the town, waiting for chances to strike. April 25th, 1949. Last night, something threw stones at the Hendrickson house for more than an hour. But these were not pebbles. They were huge rocks the size of watermelons crashing against the walls and roof. When the sun came up, Emil Hendrickson stepped outside and saw the rocks laid in a perfect circle around the house, as if it was some kind of warning. In the center of that circle was the most chilling sight of all, a pile of belongings from those who had gone missing. Jimmy Hobson's knife, Sarah Nilsson's hair ribbon, Frank Peterson's tobacco pouch, as if the thing was keeping trophies and wanted to show us. Marcus's May entries revealed a town living in fear. People stayed locked inside after dark, and even during the day, no one dared walk into the woods alone. Workers at the cannery refused to go to the outer fishing spots, and families quietly packed up to leave on the monthly supply boat. May 3rd, 1949. Albert Petka tried to fight it. Albert was a strong Russian man who had lived in Portlock since the cannery first opened in 1921. When the creature came for his dogs, Albert went after it with his axe and rifle. We heard shots in the night, then Albert's screams, and then silence. In the morning we found him lying in his yard, chest crushed in, but still breathing. He lived long enough to describe what he saw. He said it was not an animal, not quite a man, but something between. It stood upright, covered in rough, dark hair, with a long, twisted face and teeth like a wolf. It moved faster than anything that size should, and it was smart. It had used his dogs to lure him outside. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from? I'd love to see where our viewers are tuning in from. And if you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Albert died from his wounds, and the people left in Portlock gathered in the cannery foreman's office. Marcus wrote that only 23 adults and a few children remained. The choice they made ended Portlock as a town. May 10th, 1949. We all agreed, everyone leaves on the next supply ship due in 2 weeks. Some plan to move to Port Graham or Seldovia. Others talk about going as far as Seattle or Vancouver, anywhere away from here. No one will say it, but we are not leaving only because of the deaths or Albert's fate. We are leaving because we know it will never stop until we are gone. It has been hunting us one at a time, learning with every attack, growing bolder and closer. If we stay, we will end up like Jimmy Hobson and the others. Just names of people who walked into the Alaskan woods and never returned. But the worst part of Marcus Beaumont's journal was not about the killings. It was about what happened after the townspeople decided to leave. May 15th, 1949. The thing knows we are going. I do not know how it could understand what we plan, but it does. Last night it stepped right into the middle of town, standing on Main Street, or what passes for a street here. Mrs. Davidson looked from her window and said it stood still for nearly an hour, slowly turning its head to study each house, as if it were counting who was left. When the moon slipped behind a cloud and the road went dark, it was gone. But this morning we found something that froze us all with fear. Scratched into the dirt outside, every house was the same strange mark, a circle with lines stretching out from the middle like a sun. The elders said it was an old Alayat sign that meant watching or waiting. The creature was telling us that even after we left, it would not forget us. The last entries in Marcus Beaumont's journal were written while he was on the supply ship that carried the final townspeople away from Portlock in late May of 1949. His handwriting had returned to its neat and steady form, as though leaving that cursed place had finally given him back some calm. May 28, 1949. As we sailed away from Port Chatham Bay, I turned and looked back at Portlock one final time. The buildings already seemed empty and abandoned, even though we had only left that morning. The trees looked like they were creeping closer, swallowing up the homes, and I thought I saw something large moving among the woods near the ruins of the old Russian Orthodox Church. Captain Morrison said he would return in 6 months to make one more supply run, just in case someone came back or to collect any equipment that could still be used. I told him not to return. Some places are better left behind, and some things are better left untouched. But Marcus's journal did not end on that ship. He wrote one more entry half a year later, dated November 15th, 1949. Captain Morrison had gone back to Portlock despite my warnings. When his boat came back to Seldovia, his face was pale, and he would not speak of what he saw. All he would say was that the town was not the same, and that he would never go near Port Chatham Bay again. After several drinks at the Seldovia Inn, I managed to get the truth from him. According to Morrison, every building in Portlock had been torn apart, not by storms or time, but by something unbelievably strong. Roofs had been ripped away and thrown far into the woods. Walls were smashed through as though struck by giant fists. The cannery machinery, which weighed many tons, had been flipped and scattered like they were toys. But the most terrifying sight of all was what Morrison found in the middle of Main Street. The creature had built something there, a structure made of broken wood, metal, and debris from our homes, all arranged in a twisting, confusing pattern that hurt to look at. In the center of that structure was a pile of bones, human bones arranged in the same circle design we had once found outside the Hendrickson house. Morrison counted at least 12 skulls. He believed all the missing people from Portlock had been kept alive somewhere, hidden away until we left. Then the creature killed them all at once, using their bodies to create some sort of monument or warning. Morrison said he felt something watching him from the trees the whole time, though he never saw it. He only knew that if he stayed longer, he would not leave alive. I closed Marcus Beaumont's journal and sat in silence for a long while, struggling to process what I had read. The words were too clear, too exact, and too horrifying to be dismissed as fantasy or myth. More than that, they explained why the official records of Portlock's End were so vague and full of contradictions. Who would believe a story of an intelligent being that hunted people and forced an entire town to leave? How would any government file a report about something that was neither human nor animal? It was simpler to blame money problems and changes in travel routes than admit that a whole Alaskan community had been chased away by something that should not exist. Yet I could not let go of Captain Morrison's final trip and what he described. If Marcus's words were true, then buried in the ruins of that fishing town was proof of one of the most horrifying mass killings in American history. Even worse, it showed that whatever was behind it was still alive, still out there in the Alaskan wilderness. I decided to look into what became of the other survivors of Portlock, the families that had fled to nearby towns in 1949. What I found was chilling. Over the next 10 years, many of them died under strange conditions. Some were called accidents. Hunters found mauled in places where bears were never known to be dangerous. Others simply vanished while fishing or traveling between villages, never to be seen again. Marcus himself died in 1957 while visiting relatives in Port Graham. His death record said heart attack, but his nephew later told investigators that the body showed terrible injuries, as if something had struck him with great force. The nephew also said Marcus had been acting oddly in the days before, insisting that something was following him, watching him from the trees. Maybe Marcus had been a troubled man who invented stories about monsters and murders. Maybe the end of Portlock really was what the official reports claimed, a slow economic decline that drove people to more reachable places. But as I held that heavy leather journal, reading the steady handwriting and the frantic notes of fear, I could not believe it was just imagination. Marcus had recorded something real, something the authorities could not or would not face. Somewhere in the empty ruins of Portlock, Alaska, the truth still waits to be uncovered. And somewhere in the endless wilds of the Kenai Peninsula, something that once learned to hunt humans may still be there, waiting, remembering the fear it caused in a town that no longer stands. The thought that keeps me awake is not whether Marcus told the truth, but whether the creature he described ever left that ruined fishing town, or whether it is still there, building monuments out of the bones of anyone who dares wander into its land. The call came at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. The woman on the other end was crying. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I need to tell someone the truth about what really happened to my great-uncle in Kakot before I lose my courage." I had been collecting Alaskan ghost town stories for 3 years, but something in Sarah's voice made me sit up in bed and turn on my recorder. Her tone was heavy, like she had carried the secret too long. "Take your time," I told her, settling in my chair. "Tell me everything." Sarah's breathing steadied a little. "My great-uncle was Thomas Mitchell," she said. "He worked for the Kennecott Copper Corporation in the 1930s, right up until they shut the mine in 1938. But what I'm about to tell you never appeared in the company's official records. They made sure it stayed hidden." She paused, and I heard pages turning. "I found his journal 3 months ago while cleaning out my grandmother's attic. She was 96 when she died. And just before the end, she held my hand and said, 'Sarah, find Tommy's journal. Tell them what really happened to those boys.'" I had no idea what she meant until I began to read. The journal started normally. Thomas had arrived in Kennecott in 1935, working as a tunnel foreman in the Bonanza mine. The copper operation was winding down, but there was still ore to be taken and tunnels to keep stable. The first strange entry was from October 15th, 1935. Sarah's voice grew steadier as she read. "Uncle Tommy wrote about a new shaft they had opened on the north side of the mountain. He called it the Midnight Tunnel because only night crews would enter it. The daytime men refused to go near. According to Thomas's notes, the Midnight Tunnel was uncovered when an explosion opened up a natural cave system that stretched deep into the mountain. The copper there was richer than any they had mined before. But there was something else. The cavern had clearly been dug before, not with modern machines, but with old hand tools. Uncle Tommy said they found pickaxes, shovels, lanterns, tools that looked like they came from the 1880s or even earlier. But the strangest thing was there were no records of anyone mining there before Kennecott. The land had been bought straight from the government, with no previous claims listed. Thomas wrote that soon after, night crews began to hear strange noises from the depths of the tunnel, tapping sounds like someone using a pickaxe. Sometimes there were voices, but whenever they checked, they found only empty tunnels, with the old tools left behind as if just used. "The company sent in investigators," Sarah said. "But Uncle Tommy wrote they were not regular inspectors. They wore suits, carried briefcases, and spent 3 days inside the Midnight Tunnel with cameras and measuring gear. After they left, the company ordered the tunnel to be sealed. No reason given. But Thomas's curiosity got the better of him. On the night before the tunnel was to be sealed forever, he made a choice that would torment him for life. He went into the midnight tunnel alone. Sarah's voice fell to almost a whisper as she read the entry dated November 3rd, 1935. I must write this down while it is still clear in my mind, because part of me wants to forget. I carried 3 lanterns, but the dark in that tunnel swallowed the light. The tapping grew louder as I went deeper. Then the voices began. Thomas said the voices spoke English, but with strange accents, old phrases, as if from decades past. They were talking about the copper veins, about working shifts, about someone called the superintendent who would not let them rest. I followed the voices further into the cavern until I reached a chamber that opened into something enormous. My lantern light could not touch the far walls, but I saw tools everywhere. Pickaxes, shovels, ore carts, set down like the workers had just left. And then I saw them. Thomas wrote that in that chamber were the bodies of at least 30 miners. But these were not recent deaths. The bodies had been preserved naturally by the cold and dry air of the cave, but their clothing and tools showed they had been there for decades, maybe since the 1880s. Uncle Tommy wrote that the men were lying as if they had simply gone to sleep. Some still held their tools in their hands. Others were sitting near what looked like the remains of an old fire. But their faces, he said their faces looked calm, like they had finally found peace after suffering. Sarah stopped for a moment to sip some water before she went on. But that was not the most frightening part. While Uncle Tommy was studying the scene, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw 3 men walking toward him from the shadows. They wore old miners' clothes from the 1880s and carried lanterns that gave off no light. According to Thomas's journal, the 3 figures came forward slowly, without fear. They acted as though they had expected him. The oldest one, with a gray beard and gentle eyes, spoke to Thomas in a voice that sounded like it came from far away. He said his name was Charles Brennan and that he had been the mine superintendent for the first copper project in that place. He explained that they had worked the tunnel since 1882, but something terrible had happened. A cave-in trapped them, and they had died slowly in the dark, waiting for a rescue that never came. Charles Brennan told Thomas that since then, they had been trying to finish the work, unable to rest until the copper was taken out and the tunnels were safe for others. They were the ones making the tapping noises and the voices the miners had heard. Spirits of workers who had never finished their last shift. Uncle Tommy asked why no one had ever known about them, why there were no records at all. Charles Brennan said their company had been illegal, operating without claims or permits. When they vanished, it was easier for those in power to act as if they had never existed. But then Brennan revealed something that changed everything. The Kennecott Corporation already knew. The company had found the bodies long before and covered it up so it would not interfere with their own mines. The men in suits who had entered the midnight tunnel were not studying copper deposits. They were there to find a way to hide the proof of the earlier miners and their deaths. Charles Brennan said the company planned to seal the tunnel with dynamite, locking their bodies inside forever. He begged Thomas to make sure they were buried properly, to let the world know what had really happened. Thomas promised he would tell their story. But when he went back to the surface, he learned the company was already prepared for this. The next day, Thomas was summoned to the supervisor's office and told he was being sent at once to a job in Arizona. His replacement was already on the way to Alaska. He was given only 24 hours to pack and leave on the next boat to Seattle. When he asked about the midnight tunnel, the supervisor told him it had been sealed shut the night before for safety reasons. He also warned Thomas that miners who spread tales about unsafe tunnels or strange things underground, often found themselves unable to get work anywhere else. Sarah's tone grew harsh as she spoke. Uncle Tommy knew it was a threat. He had a wife and two small children, so he accepted the transfer and never spoke openly about what he had seen. But he never forgot those 30 miners left behind in the dark. For the rest of his life, he tried to honor his promise to Charles Brennan. He wrote letters to government offices, reached out to newspapers, and even contacted history groups. But Kennecott had erased every trace of the earlier mining camp. There were no records, no lists of missing men, no families demanding answers about miners who had been erased from history as though they had never lived. The later entries in his journal were heartbreaking, Sarah said. Uncle Tommy wrote about dreams where he heard the tapping from the sealed tunnel. He saw Charles Brennan in his sleep, asking why he had not kept his word. The guilt never left him. Thomas Mitchell died in 1967, carrying the secret to his grave, but he left behind instructions that his journal should be passed down in the family, so one day someone would be able to share the truth he could not. I have been digging into this for months, Sarah said. I reached out to the National Park Service since Kennecott is now preserved as a historic site. I spoke to historians, mining experts, anyone who would listen, and what I found was nothing. There are no records of any mining activity in that area before Kennecott. No missing miners from the 1880s. No one named Charles Brennan in any official records, but Sarah refused to give up. She turned to genealogy research and finally uncovered something. There had been a Charles Brennan who worked for different mining companies across the West in the 1880s. He had vanished in 1882 while working on a copper prospect in Alaska Territory. His wife had filed a missing person report, but he was never found. Sarah also discovered records of 6 other miners who had disappeared in the same region during the same time. All of them had been working for small mining companies that shut down not long after their workers went missing. Every disappearance was explained away as miners who had simply left to chase better chances somewhere else without telling anyone. But Sarah had found something troubling about the Kennett Corporation's old records. Most of the company's papers had been placed in different archives, but there was a 20-year hole in their files from 1918 to 1938. The company claimed those records were lost in a warehouse fire in Seattle in 1955. But when Sarah checked the insurance files for that warehouse, there was no fire at all. The Kennett Corporation had destroyed those documents on purpose, and Sarah believed she now knew the reason. Uncle Tommy had not been the only one who had seen the bodies in the midnight tunnel. The company had been hiding that truth for decades. When Sarah's story finally reached its end, I realized I believed every word. It was not just the details being clear, or the steady tone in her voice, or even the emotion in her words. It was that her account matched too closely with other cover-ups I had studied from that time. The sudden transfers, the hidden threats, the vanishing files, it all fit. I am calling you because I have run out of choices, Sarah finished. I made a promise to my grandmother, and through her, to Uncle Tommy, and to Charles Brennan. Those 30 miners have the right to be remembered. Their story should not be buried. And maybe if more people know the truth, someone with the means will step forward and find a way to give them the proper rest they never got. After Sarah ended the call, I stayed in the dark for a long time, letting her story settle. The Kennett mine had been abandoned for more than 80 years, and the place had long since been marked as a protected historic site. If the midnight tunnel had ever truly been there, it would now be crushed under layers of ice and rock, unreachable by anyone. Yet late at night, I find myself thinking back to Thomas Mitchell's journal and to the words of Charles Brennan. Maybe somewhere in those frozen Alaskan peaks, those 30 miners are still waiting for someone brave enough to speak for them. And maybe, just maybe, in that endless dark, They are still tapping at the walls, still trying to finish their last shift. Professor Elena Rodriguez thought she was just putting together a straightforward history paper about the Chilla Trail. But when she began speaking with the descendants of people who had lived through it, she uncovered something the official records had erased. What she found would rewrite the accepted story of the deadliest disaster of the Klondike Gold Rush and explain why one entire town had disappeared off maps forever. Elena had been teaching Alaskan history at the University of Alaska Anchorage for over 15 years when she chose to use her sabbatical to look more closely at the Palm Sunday avalanche of April 3rd, 1898. The official version was simple enough. Between 60 and 70 gold seekers had died when a series of avalanches struck the Chilkoot Trail near a place called the Scales. A tragic event, but one explained as nature colliding with human ambition in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. Yet Elena was not the kind of historian to take official papers as the final word. She wanted the personal voices behind those numbers, the real stories that gave shape to the tragedy. So she began contacting family groups and genealogical researchers to see if descendants of Daya residents had held on to letters, diaries, or oral histories from that spring in 1898. The first strange clue appeared in a letter she received from Margaret Thompson, whose great-great-grandfather had owned a supply shop in Daya during the gold rush. Dear Professor Rodriguez, the letter began, Margaret had written, I have been tracing my family's history for 2 decades, and I found something about the avalanche that troubles me deeply. My ancestor, James Thompson, kept a private journal where he wrote that the avalanche was not completely natural. I know this sounds unreal, but I have proof I think you should see. Elena arranged to visit Margaret at her home in Wasilla, where she was shown a collection of documents carefully passed down through 5 generations of the Thompson family. The centerpiece was James Thompson's old ledger, which doubled as his diary during his years in Daya. The entries from the early months of 1898 showed a town filled with greed, desperation, and an ever-growing competition that was turning dangerous. February 15th, 1898. Elena read the faded ink aloud. The Haraman Consortium has been working in the avalanche zones above the Scales for 3 weeks now. They say it's for safety checks on their transport business, but I've seen them setting charges that could start slides if blown. When I asked their boss, he told me to stay quiet if I wanted to keep supplying his crews. Elena lifted her eyes. Who exactly were the Haraman Consortium? Margaret handed her a folder of old newspaper clippings. It took me years to track them down, she explained. They were wealthy Seattle investors who poured money into building a tramway on the Chilkoot Trail. But they had direct competition, the Chilkoot Railroad and Transport Company, who were building another route. Whoever finished first would control all the freight traffic between Daya and the Klondike goldfields. The stakes were enormous. Elena read further into the diary. The entries from March 1898 showed the rivalry growing more hostile, with Daya townsfolk increasingly worried about how far the fight was going. March 8th, 1898. 3 more men from the CR&T company went missing near the Scales yesterday. Their boss says they deserted, but their belongings and pay are untouched. Thomas McKinnon, a supply hauler, claims he saw armed men from both companies watching the work sites at night. This is no longer about building tramways. This has turned into a war, and the stampeders will be the ones to suffer. But the entry that shook Elena the most was written on March 30th, just days before the avalanche struck. March 30th, 1898. I have learned something that chills me. Jonathan Hartwell, a surveyor for the Haraman Consortium, came into my shop drunk and afraid. He told me the company was planning to trigger a controlled avalanche to wipe out the CR&T crews. He admitted dynamite had been set in the snow for weeks, waiting for the right storm, but now he fears the slide will be far bigger than planned. He believes it will crash down the whole mountain and kill not just the rival workers, but hundreds of travelers on the trail. He asked if I could send word to Skagway, but I told him by the time a warning got there, it would be too late. Elena put the diary down, her face pale. This journal is accusing the Harriman Consortium of causing the Palm Sunday avalanche on purpose. That would not be an accident. It would be mass murder. Margaret nodded, grim. Keep reading. It grows worse. Elena turned to the page dated April 3rd, 1898, the day itself. April 3rd, 1898. It happens just as Hartwell said. The slides began before dawn and carried on into the morning. These were not random snowfalls from weak slopes. I could hear the blasts echoing through the peaks. Timed explosions that brought tons of snow down onto the CR&T work crews. By noon, at least 60 were dead, including every rival worker. The Harriman Consortium cleared their competition from the mountain and secured their tramway route. But the cost in lives is unthinkable. But James Thompson had written something even darker. According to his journal, the avalanche was planned to fall during the weekly caravan from Dia to the Scales, when the trail would be busiest with stampeders hauling back gold. April 4th, 1898. Now I see the full truth. While rescuers dug for the buried, men from the Harriman Consortium robbed the dead and stripped supplies from the wreckage. They stole thousands of dollars in gold, claiming it was simply salvage. Families asked about missing keepsakes and valuables, but they were told everything was buried too deep or carried away by later slides. Elena closed the diary. Did anyone ever report this? Margaret opened another folder, her expression heavy. This is the part that still disturbs me. Family letters say James Thompson went to the U.S. Marshal in Skagway to tell him everything. But when he got there, the Marshal had suddenly been transferred to Seattle. The deputy he met instead, William Harrison, turned out to be a secret business partner in the Harriman Consortium. Elena then spent months chasing down other families of Dia residents, and what she found formed a chilling picture. Each family had kept letters, notes, or memories that pointed to the same thing, that the avalanche was not nature's doing, but a crime carried out by men with money to protect. The strongest proof came from the family of Dr. Charles Woodruff, the town's doctor. His preserved medical notes, held by his granddaughter in Juneau, showed autopsy details that clashed with the official reports. Many avalanche victims had injuries that happened before they were buried in snow. Elena read the doctor's words aloud. Gunshot wounds, stab wounds, blows to the head and chest. At least 20 of them were killed before the snow fell. I tried to report these findings, but I was warned my license would be revoked if I kept insisting. Dr. Woodruff had been forced to leave Alaska soon after, even though he had a successful practice. His work was handed to a new doctor with financial links to the Harriman Consortium, who rewrote the records so that every death was blamed on suffocation and exposure. But perhaps the clearest piece of evidence Elena found came from the company's own files. A Seattle law firm had given the Harriman Consortium's papers to the University of Washington in 1975. Elena spent weeks digging through boxes of letters, money reports, and private memos. One letter dated March 15, 1898 stood out. Consortium leader Edward Harriman had written to his partners, "The CR&T company must be removed before they finish their tramway. I have talked with our engineering experts, and they believe that setting off a chain of controlled blasts could cause snowslides that would look completely natural while still achieving what we need. The price will be high, but the huge profits from controlling traffic on the Chilkoot Trail make the cost worth it." A follow-up note dated April 5th, just 2 days after the avalanche, gave even clearer details. Project Snowslide had been carried out successfully. All CR&T workers were wiped out, and their building equipment was destroyed. Recovery crews gathered nearly $47,000 in gold and useful materials from the wreckage. Travel on the trail could now be rerouted to the northern path in about 6 weeks, giving the consortium total control over cargo headed to the Klondike. Elena also found that the Harriman Consortium had secretly paid off local officials with large sums of money to make sure no deep investigation into the avalanche was ever done. A record book from April 1898 listed payments of $15,000 marked as territorial office costs and investigation handling. The cover-up had been clean and complete. Within half a year of the Palm Sunday avalanche, the Harriman Consortium had finished their tramway project and gained full control of freight moving between Dia and the Klondike goldfields. Their competitor, the CR&T Company, was broken apart, and its backers lost everything they had invested. Even more troubling, the avalanche served as a believable reason for the disappearance of dozens of people who might have exposed the crimes of the consortium. But Elena uncovered proof that the plot stretched even deeper and reached into the very fate of Dia itself. As the truth of the avalanche began to spread quietly among those who survived, more and more townspeople started leaving. They feared not only more avalanches but also the ruthless businessmen who had already proven they would kill to protect their profits. A letter from Sarah McKinnon to her sister in Seattle, written in June 1898, showed how afraid people had become. "We cannot stay here any longer. Too many know the truth about what happened on the mountain, and too many strange accidents have happened to people who might speak out to the wrong ears." James Thompson's store burned down with him inside just last week. Dr. Woodruff left for Seattle after being threatened with death. The avalanche was only the start. These men will kill anyone who stands in their way, and we have seen with our own eyes what they can do. Elena's research showed that the leaving of Dia sped up through 1898 and 1899. Not for financial reasons, as the official story said, but because the townsfolk were being slowly frightened away by the very businessmen who had gained wealth from the Klondike gold trade. Families who could have stayed to rebuild instead ran to other towns or even left Alaska for good, carrying the truth with them about what really happened during the Palm Sunday avalanche. By 1900, the townspeople had dropped from more than 8,000 at its height to fewer than 500. The post office closed, shops shut down, and the place started sliding into emptiness. The Harriman Consortium, having reached its goals, shifted their work to Skagway and later sold their transport projects to larger rail companies. Elena ended her study filled with sorrow and anger. The Palm Sunday avalanche had not been an accident of nature. It was a carefully planned killing meant to wipe out competition and hide the theft of millions in gold. 60 to 70 innocent lives were lost, not because of snow that was unstable, but because rich investors decided that people's lives were just another cost of business in Alaska's wilderness. But perhaps the worst truth was that the cover-up worked. For more than 100 years, history books had accepted the claim that the avalanche was just a sad natural disaster. The dead were remembered as unlucky fortune seekers who perished chasing dreams of gold, when in reality they had been murdered by the same people meant to help them reach the Klondike. Elena tried to publish her findings in several history journals, but all rejected her. Editors said her claims were too speculative, that she had too little proof, and that her work would hurt Alaska's tourism if it was printed. One editor even wrote, "Even if what you claim is true, what good would come from digging up this 100-year-old case? The guilty are long gone, and survivors and families have moved on. But Elena Rodriguez had not spent 2 years uncovering the truth about Dia just to see it buried once more. She published her work herself and began giving talks at history gatherings and local events across Alaska. Bit by bit, other researchers started to look into the proof she had found, and more papers began turning up from family records and forgotten files. Today, Elena's work has started to shift how scholars see not only the Palm Sunday avalanche, but the whole history of greed and violence tied to the Klondike Gold Rush. Dia was not left behind simply because of money troubles or new transport paths. It became empty because its people knew they lived under the power of men who saw human lives as numbers on a balance sheet. The truth about Dia shows us that some ghost towns are not haunted by spirits, but by the very real ghosts of greed, violence, and injustice that continue to echo in silence across generations. Every summer, the Henderson family met for a reunion in Juneau. But in 2019, Grandmother Ruth finally explained why she never, ever wanted to visit the Treadwell ruins across the channel. What she revealed about the Great Mine Flood of 1917 would change everything her family thought they knew about their past, and why certain sounds still woke her screaming at night. Ruth Henderson was 87 when her grandson David first suggested they add the Treadwell Historic Trail to their reunion trip. He thought it would be educational. "It's right here in our backyard," he argued. "We've come to Juneau for 20 years, and not once have we walked through the old mines." Ruth's answer was instant and absolute. "No," she said, her voice sharp and firm. "We will not be going to that place ever." For years, her family simply accepted Ruth's strange dislike of the ruins across Gastineau Channel. They guessed it was just an old woman's dislike of rough trails, or maybe some superstition about abandoned places. But in 2019, as Ruth's health began to fail, she realized she did not have many more reunions left. She made a choice that would leave her family haunted for generations. "I must tell you something about Treadwell," she declared at their Saturday night dinner at the Twisted Fish Company. "Something about why we can never go there and why our family has held a terrible secret for over 100 years. David Henderson, her youngest grandson, and a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, quickly pulled out his phone to record her words. Ruth saw and gave him a small nod. "My great-grandfather was Thomas Anderson," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "He had come to Alaska from Sweden in 1903 to work at the Treadwell mines. The records say he died in the cave-in and flooding of April 1917. But that is not the full truth. Thomas Anderson died weeks before the flood, and he was killed to keep him silent about something that could have ruined the mining company if it had come out." Ruth reached into her purse and took out a small leather pouch that none of her family had ever seen. Inside were old papers wrapped in cloth, letters in Swedish, company memos, and what looked like official reports. These had been hidden in the walls of Thomas's boarding house room. Ruth continued, "When the building was torn down in 1923, his roommate found them and passed them to my grandmother. She never showed them to anyone, too afraid of what might happen if the wrong people learned what Thomas had discovered." According to Ruth's translation of Thomas Anderson's letters to his brother back in Sweden, the Treadwell mine had been using child workers in the most dangerous sections of the tunnels since at least 1905. Boys as young as 10 were being sent into cramped shafts and unstable areas where grown men could not safely work. The company brought these children from orphanages in Seattle and San Francisco. Ruth read from one of Thomas's letters, dated November 1915. The children were promised education and training, but instead they worked 14-hour days in deadly conditions that killed them regularly. Thomas wrote that in his 12 years at Treadwell, he had seen at least 60 boys die in accidents that were never officially reported. But the child labor was not the worst secret Thomas uncovered. In early 1917, he learned that the mine's structural problems were far worse than what officials were telling investors or the government. The underground supports were breaking down throughout the mine, and engineers had warned that a massive collapse was coming. Thomas wrote that the company had three choices, Ruth explained, her voice growing firmer as she spoke. They could spend millions to fix the mines. They could slowly shut down and move people away. Or they could trigger a disaster, claim insurance money, and erase proof of their illegal child labor. According to these records, they chose the third. David looked up from his phone. Are you saying the cave-in was planned? Ruth gave a grave nod. Thomas had discovered that engineers were actually weakening supports in key parts of the mine. They planned to cause a controlled collapse that would flood the tunnels with seawater and wash away all evidence of the dead children. The insurance payment would cover their losses, and they could blame it all on unstable geology. But Thomas only found out by accident. On March 8, 1917, while working in a section supposedly being reinforced, he saw engineers placing explosives in support beams instead of strengthening them. When he asked his boss about it, he was told to mind his own business and report for another job. The next day, Thomas grew suspicious and started keeping watch on which parts of the mine were being reinforced and which workers were being moved elsewhere. Ruth said, continuing her story. What he discovered was that while the adult miners were being slowly moved away from the areas where explosives were being set, the children who worked in the tight tunnels were still being sent into those same dangerous places each day. From Thomas's letters, it became clear that the planned cave-in was not just meant to hide proof of child labor. It was designed to kill the young workers who could testify against the company. Their bodies would be buried forever under seawater and rock. Thomas wrote to his brother that he could not stand by and let children be murdered just to protect money, Ruth said. On March 20th, 1917, he sent a letter to federal officials in Seattle, explaining everything he had learned about the use of child workers and the plan to collapse the mine. Ruth showed a carbon copy of the letter, yellowed with age but still readable. David read it aloud. To the Federal Mining Safety Commission, I report violations of labor laws and deadly dangers at the Treadwell Mine on Douglas Island. Officials are using children as young as 10 underground, leading to many hidden deaths. I also have proof that engineers are planning a collapse to erase the crimes and silence witnesses. Please investigate before lives are lost. But the letter never made it to the authorities. It was taken by a company security officer who worked directly for Treadwell. 3 days later, Thomas was called to meet with Superintendent John Kinsey. Thomas wrote one last letter to his brother on March 23rd, Ruth said, opening the final paper. He knew he was in trouble, but hoped he could convince Kinsey to stop the plan. That letter was found hidden under his bed after he vanished. The last letter told everything. The company had been hiding child deaths for years, bribing officials to look the other way, and even using insurance fraud to gain profit from stage accidents. The April 1917 cave-in was meant to be the final act, a fake disaster to cover up the truth and collect millions in claims. Thomas wrote that Kinsey offered him a better job in Chile if he stayed quiet. Ruth explained, when Thomas refused, Kinsey warned him that men who cause problems for the company often had accidents in the mines. On March 25, 1917, Thomas was found dead in his room. The cause was listed as a heart attack, but his roommate said his body looked beaten. No inquiry was made, and he was buried quickly before friends could see him. His death did not stop the plan, Ruth continued. On April 21, 1917, explosives hidden in the mine were set off during a shift change when few adults were inside. The collapse and flood happened just as planned. But one thing went wrong. Dozens of children who should have been underground were saved by a supervisor who distrusted the company. His name was Carl Magnuson, a friend of Thomas. After Thomas's death, Carl had found the letters and understood the danger. On the night of the blast, he broke orders and led the child workers out. The company claimed only animals had died, but this was not true. Ruth said at least 23 children drowned, trapped before they could escape. Their bodies were never found because no search was made. On paper, these children never existed. Carl tried to tell federal officials what had really happened, but like Thomas, he died soon after. He was crushed in a so-called accident while working alone. The surviving children were moved to other mines in Alaska, threatened to stay silent. Most were too scared or broken to talk. But one child was 10-year-old Eric Anderson, Thomas's grandson, who had been sent to Treadwell after his parents died in a Seattle fire. Ruth wiped tears as she spoke. Eric was her grandfather. He survived because Carl pulled him out, but he lived haunted by the voices of the children who drowned. In dreams, he heard them crying from under the water. That was why Ruth never visited the ruins. The children are still down there, still calling for their story to be told. David had stopped recording and sat staring at his grandmother. Did she have proof beyond the letters? Ruth reached into her purse and pulled out a small metal tag. This was Eric's work tag from Treadwell. All child workers had to wear them so bodies could be named if they died. Eric kept his tag his whole life in memory of those lost. It read, Treadwell Mines, Child Worker 247 East Anderson, 1917. The company swore they never used children, Ruth said. But these tags were records, proof of their crimes. That was why they wanted the bodies hidden forever. Her words changed everything. The collapse, long thought to be a natural accident, was actually a planned killing to hide decades of child labor and remove witnesses. After the disaster, the company collected over $2 million in insurance, using it to expand abroad where rules were weaker. The dead children were erased from the records. Their families told lies. David asked if Ruth ever thought of making this public. She shook her head. Who would believe it now? The guilty men were gone, the company long dissolved. But she wanted her family to know the truth, to understand why the place should never be disturbed. The children deserve peace. As the family sat in silence, David thought of the tourists who came every year to take photos of the ruins, never knowing it was a graveyard hiding one of the worst corporate crimes in history. Ruth died in her sleep 6 months later, leaving behind the burden of a secret carried for generations. But she had kept her promise to her grandfather, telling the truth at last. The Henderson family never visited the ruins, but on quiet summer nights when wind blew across Gastineau Channel, David sometimes thought he could hear faint voices drifting from Douglas Island. The voices of children crying from the flooded mines, still waiting for someone to bring them home. Jake Morrison was only trying to earn a living when he took the demolition job at the Buckner building in 2018. The city told him it was a simple job. They never said what they expected him to uncover. Jake had spent 15 years in Alaska construction, mostly dealing with dangerous material in old sites. The pay was fair, and he was used to asbestos, lead, and unsafe structures. When the city of Whittier hired him to check the old Buckner building, he thought it would be routine. The building had stood since 1953, built by the Army as a city under one roof, 6 stories high, almost 500 feet long, with about 275,000 square feet of space. It had housed over 1,000 soldiers and families during the Cold War. Abandoned in 1960, it had slowly decayed for nearly 60 years. Jake's job was simple: check the lower levels, mark dangers, and estimate demolition costs. The land was valuable, and the city wanted the structure gone. But what should have been a quick 2-day job became something Jake would never forget. The first sign came in the basement. He had been told the lower floors were filled with floodwater from years of neglect. But what he found was stranger. The water was not dirty or still. It was flowing as if filtered. It was perfectly clear. Jake later said it should have been foul after decades in a concrete basement. Instead, it looked managed. Lights glowed beneath the surface in some areas. The wiring should have been dead, but parts of the building still had power. Someone was paying to keep things running. He photographed everything and sent a report, expecting the city to investigate. Instead, he got a call from a man named Dr. Richard Vasquez, claiming to represent the state environmental office. Dr. Vasquez said some parts of the building had leftover classified materials from the Army, and that Jake's job now included documenting and removing them under federal watch. The new pay was much higher, so Jake kept quiet at first. But as he searched deeper under Vasquez's direction, he realized the Army had left far more than junk. Behind false walls and sealed doors, Jake found labs that looked abandoned suddenly, as if people had left in a rush. Equipment was still plugged in. Experiments seemed left unfinished. The first lab was hidden inside the medical wing on the 3rd floor. A fake wall had been built to conceal it. Inside were exam tables with restraints, monitors still recording, and tanks filled with preserving liquid. Vasquez called it old Cold War medical research and said it needed removal. Jake spent 3 days cataloging everything before federal agents arrived to haul away what Vasquez called sensitive equipment. But Jake had been around long enough to see the truth. The machines were not 60 years old. The monitors were digital, with USB ports. Some computers even had modern operating systems. When Jake pointed this out, Vasquez told him the machines had been upgraded for security and warned him not to ask questions. Still, Jake could not ignore the feeling that something was wrong. After the agents cleared the first lab, he began searching on his own. In the basement levels, he discovered something beyond anything he imagined. There was a whole floor not listed on any blueprint. You could only reach it through a service elevator with a special key card. Using bypass tricks, Jake got it working. What he found below was shocking. It was not abandoned. It was alive. Air flowed fresh. Water was clean. Food supplies were recent. The labs looked like those in a modern research hospital. The underground site had long, sterile halls, rooms kept at exact temperatures, and active experiments. He found bedrooms that looked recently used, meeting rooms with whiteboards covered in equations, and a central computer system that was still tracking dozens of studies. The most disturbing thing Jake found were the observation rooms. They had one-way glass looking into chambers that were clearly built to keep people inside. Some of those rooms had medical gear hooked up, IV tubes, monitors, and strange machines he couldn't recognize. There were log books filled with notes about tests going back to the 1960s, but there were also entries from only a few years earlier. Whatever had started in that building during the Cold War hadn't really stopped when the Army left in 1960. Jake tried to take pictures of everything in the hidden areas, but when he went to upload them online, his internet suddenly didn't work. Even his phone signal, which worked fine everywhere else in Whittier, completely shut off inside the Buckner building. That was when he realized he was being watched. Cameras were hidden in every hallway and room, and someone was blocking all outside communication from inside the building itself. When he finally went to leave, the main doors were locked tight and needed a code he didn't have. He was trapped inside with proof that human experiments were still being carried out. For 2 days, Jake tried to find another way out, sneaking through empty corridors and avoiding the parts of the building he thought were still in use. He finally escaped through a broken section of wall, but not before making one last discovery that would haunt him forever. He found the morgue in the basement, linked directly to the secret labs. Inside were freezer units holding bodies, and many of them were too fresh to be from the 1960s. The tags on them listed names and recent dates, and Jake recognized some as people reported missing in Alaska communities. He took pictures of as many tags as he could before escaping. Once outside, he went straight to the Alaska State Police and the FBI. But by the time they searched the building the very next day, the labs had been stripped bare, the morgue cleaned spotless, and every piece of equipment gone. That night, Jake got a call from Dr. Vasquez, who told him he had fallen for an elaborate hoax. Vasquez claimed urban explorers had been staging fake horror scenes inside the abandoned base, and that everything Jake saw had been just props left behind. He even offered Jake a large payout in a contract to keep him silent. But Jake knew what real medical equipment looked like, and he refused. Instead, he began digging into the true history of the Buckner building and the Cold War projects it once held. Through old records, Jake learned that the Army had carried out experiments in psychological warfare in Whittier from 1953 to at least 1975. They tested ways to break minds using sensory deprivation, brainwashing, and psychological manipulation that could be turned on prisoners or defectors. It was all part of a larger hidden program spread across several sites in Alaska. His research showed that these programs had not actually ended, but were handed over to private contractors who continued the work in secret under new funding. The Buckner building was never truly abandoned. It had been used as a running lab for decades, disguised as a crumbling Cold War shell. The push to demolish it was not because it was falling apart, Jake realized, but because officials finally discovered the truth and wanted the evidence destroyed. His own work inside had been less about demolition and more about recording what needed to be cleared out before they tore the building down. Jake sent his reports to agencies, news outlets, and human rights groups. Most brushed him off, calling his story conspiracy talk, but a few investigators looked closer at the disappearances he linked to the site. They noticed a troubling pattern. Over 20 years, more than 40 people had gone missing within 100 miles of Whittier. Most were people without close families, transients, homeless, or those no one would report missing right away. Spread out across years in different jurisdictions, the cases never looked connected until Jake laid them together. The state police eventually opened a case into the missing people, but when they tried to examine the Buckner building, federal authorities blocked them, saying the site contained classified material. Soon after, new fences and cameras went up around the structure, locking it down even further. Jake swore that what he had seen was no hoax. He believed people were still being kept in secret facilities across Alaska, with Buckner only one part of a larger network. The Cold War may have ended, but the projects from that time had not died. They had simply grown, with modern technology making them even harder to detect. By 2019, Jake had left Alaska, but he kept searching for similar sites at other military ruins across the U.S. He found enough to believe Buckner was not an isolated case, but a window into a massive system of experiments the government still protected. What horrified him most was not the past of the Buckner building, but what was happening inside it now. Layers of secrecy and classification made sure no one could expose the programs, while lives continued to be used as expendable in the name of national defense. Buckner was a cold, concrete reminder of what military ambition had cost, and a warning that those costs were still being paid. To tourists in Whittier, the building looked like a decaying relic, a ruin to photograph and wonder about. But if Jake Morrison was right, it was something far darker. It was an active crime scene, where experiments on human beings still went on, hidden behind steel doors and government silence. When DNA testing connected Amy Cannery to relatives in King Island, she was thrilled. But her excitement turned to horror when she learned why her great-grandmother never spoke about the village of Ukivak. What Amy discovered through her genealogy research would reveal a government conspiracy so callous and deliberate that it had erased an entire community from existence, leaving behind only empty houses, clinging to cliffs, and the ghosts of cultural genocide. Amy Cannery had always known she was Inupiat, but her family history had been fragmented by generations of silence and painful memories that her elders refused to discuss. When she submitted her DNA sample to Ancestry DNA in 2019, she was hoping to connect with distant relatives and perhaps fill in some of the gaps in her family tree. She never expected to uncover a story that would fundamentally change her understanding of her family's past and reveal one of the most systematic and cruel acts of cultural destruction in Alaskan history. The DNA results showed strong connections to people with surnames like Yatunguk, Bikongana, and Pushuk, names that Amy had never heard before, but that seemed to call to something deep in her genetic memory. When she reached out to her matches, she learned that they were descendants of people who had lived on a remote island in the Bering Sea called Ugwak, or King Island, in a village known as Ukivak. I had never heard of King Island or Ukiv, Amy explained. When I asked my grandmother about it, she just looked at me with this expression of pure pain and said, "That is a place we do not talk about. Some wounds are too deep to ever heal." But I could not let it go. The DNA connections were too strong, and I had to know why my family had hidden this part of our past so completely. Amy began looking into Ukivak and learned it had once been a remarkable place, a village built on wooden stilts against the steep cliffs of King Island. For centuries, Inupiat families had lived there, surviving in one of the hardest environments on Earth. The Uguvang, as they called themselves, were skilled hunters and builders who knew how to live on the rocky island where survival required teamwork and deep knowledge of the land and sea. But Amy also found that Ukivak had been abandoned in the late 1960s when everyone was moved to mainland Alaska towns. The official reason given was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs closed the school in 1959, saying a big boulder above it was about to fall and that families moved so their children could still get schooling. On paper, it sounded like a reasonable choice, Amy said, but when she began talking to descendants of the people from Ukivak, she heard something very different. They spoke of children being taken at night, families threatened with losing government help if they refused to move, and an entire community destroyed because outsiders thought their way of life did not fit into modern progress. Amy's biggest discovery came when she met Eleanor Pushuk, an elderly woman from Nome, who had been born in Ukivak in 1943. Eleanor had tried all her life to forget her childhood, but after Amy explained her family ties, she finally agreed to share what really happened. She told Amy the school closure was not about safety at all. It was about forcing the Uguvang to give up their old ways and become part of Western society. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had been planning to shut down remote villages across Alaska as part of something they called modernization. Ukivak was chosen as a test because it was so isolated that no one would pay attention. Eleanor remembered when federal agents came in 1958 and told leaders their children could no longer go to school on the island. The agents said the small school was not good enough and that the children needed to go to mainland schools to learn modern life. When elders argued that their children were already learning English and Inupiat, the agents told them their native education did not count. Families who refused would lose medical care and food programs that they had come to rely on. Amy later found government papers declassified in the 1990s during investigations into Native policies that confirmed everything. The closure of Ukivak was part of a larger plan called the Alaska Native Settlement Initiative. Its goal was to move Native families into selected towns where they could be watched and controlled more easily. The papers were shocking, Amy said. They talked about the best ways to break apart Native villages, how to silence elders who resisted, and even cost reports on forced relocation. The officials wrote about Native families as if they were livestock being moved. One memo from March 1959 even called Ukivak an ideal test case because it was small, remote, and unlikely to attract media. It said the isolation made it easy to try psychological pressure techniques. Amy learned that these included cutting off medicine and mail and spreading lies that the people of Ukivak carried diseases. When some families still refused to leave, federal agents came and took their children to faraway boarding schools. Parents were told they could only see their children again if they moved permanently to approved towns. EerieHOUR shared the night they came for the children. Amy said, her voice shaking. A Coast Guard ship came during a storm, with agents claiming it was for a medical evacuation. They gathered up every child over 6 years old and took them onto the ship. Parents who resisted were threatened with arrest for standing in the way of federal officers. Children screamed for their parents screamed for their children, but the agents ignored them all. The children were sent to boarding schools across Alaska and even the lower 48 states, where they were not allowed to speak Inupiat and were punished for practicing their culture. Many never saw their families again. The trauma broke the connections between generations. EerieHOUR herself was taken at age 7 to a school in Sitka. She told Amy she cried herself to sleep every night for a year, waiting for her parents to come. But over time, the school leaders convinced her parents had abandoned her, that they cared more about their old ways than about her future. The children were told again and again that their parents were ignorant, that their culture was backwards, and that they should be grateful to the government. Over time, many children believed these lies, leaving a generation of Alaska Natives ashamed of their identity and unable to return home even as adults. Meanwhile, the parents left behind in Ukivak struggled without their children. Their way of life could not continue, and slowly families moved to the mainland. By 1970, the island was empty. The cruelest part, Amy said, was that the giant boulder that supposedly threatened the school never fell. When former residents visited in the 1980s, the boulder was still in place and the school still standing. The entire safety story had been a lie to cover cultural destruction. Amy's research showed the same methods had been used to wipe out dozens of other Native villages during the 1950s and 1960s. Each time, the pattern repeated. First, officials cut off supplies and services. Then, they took away the children. Last, they pressured families with threats and offers of relocation until the community collapsed. The damage from those policies is still felt in Alaska Native families today. Generations lost their homelands and faced trauma that was never admitted or repaired by the government. EerieHOUR told Amy she dreamed of Ukivak for decades. She saw the houses on stilts, heard the waves, and remembered the elders' faces. But she was too afraid to speak of it, taught that missing her old life meant weakness. Amy's search for family history became a journey of healing. In 2020, she brought together Ukivak descendants who had been scattered for over half a century. When they met, many recognized each other at once through family resemblances, even though they had never met before. One elder looked at a younger man and said, "You have your grandfather's eyes," even though that grandfather had died in Ukivak 60 years earlier. The gathering allowed old memories to surface, stories to be shared, and new generations to learn about a past hidden from them. But it was also a place to talk about how these forced relocations still affect Native communities today. Amy said they realized what happened was not just history. The same agencies still control Native communities, still seeing traditional life as something in the way of progress. Until the truth of places like Ukivok is faced, nothing will stop it from happening again. Amy Kanakarat's search uncovered far more than family ties. It revealed a hidden campaign of cultural destruction that had been covered up for over 60 years. The abandoned houses of Ukivok, still standing on the cliffs, remain as reminders of a community that refused to vanish completely, preserved in the DNA and memories of their descendants who are now ready to speak. Every time Amy looks at her DNA matches, she sees the names of people who should have grown up in Ukivok, who should have hunted walrus, gathered bird eggs, and spoken Inupiat as their first language. Instead, they were scattered and told to forget who they were. But DNA does not lie, and neither do the stories of elders who lived through it. Ukivok may stand empty, but the Ugyuvangmiut are still here, and they will not let their story be buried. The history of Ukivok shows that ghost towns are not always made by economics or disasters. Sometimes they are created by deliberate acts meant to erase whole cultures. But it also shows that people can endure, even when powerful forces try to erase them. The earthquake photographs were supposed to be routine disaster records, but when curator Diana Walsh was preparing the 1964 Portage exhibit, she noticed something in the background of certain photos that made her blood turn cold. What she uncovered revealed that the most devastating earthquake in North American history had been preceded by supernatural events so disturbing that officials spent decades covering them up. Diana Walsh had worked as a curator for the Alaska Historical Society for 12 years. When she was given the task of organizing a 50th anniversary exhibition for the Great Alaska Earthquake of March the 27th, 1964. The 9.2 quake had been the strongest earthquake ever recorded in North America, destroying whole towns and killing 131 people. Portage, a small community in the Turnagain Arm south of Anchorage, had been completely ruined and later abandoned, becoming one of Alaska's most well-known ghost towns. Diana's role was to put together photographs, documents, and objects that could tell the story of how the earthquake had changed life for Alaskan communities. She had access to thousands of pictures from government archives, newspapers, and private family donations. Many showed aerial views of destroyed buildings, rescue operations, and the huge changes to the land caused by the quake. Most of the images were simple records that showed the damage with clear detail. But as Diana studied the collection, she began noticing strange details in some photographs taken in the weeks before the earthquake happened. These were ordinary photos meant to show daily life in Portage and other towns. But in the backgrounds, there were things that made no sense. The first strange photo came from Robert Hriss, a freelance photographer who had spent the winter of 1963 to 64 capturing scenes of small Alaska communities. Diana described how the image showed children playing in the snow outside the Portage post office on March 20th, just 1 week before the earthquake. But when she looked closely, she saw what looked like cracks in the ground behind the children. The cracks didn't look random. They formed sharp shapes that almost looked like symbols or writing. At first, Diana assumed the shapes were just camera issues or maybe shadows caused by unusual light. But when she later found the same kinds of shapes in photographs taken in other towns that were also hit hard by the earthquake, she began to think something bigger was happening. In total, she found 12 photos taken between March 10th and March 26, 1964, across south-central Alaska. All showed the same kind of strange ground markings, made of snow, ice, or bare soil. The designs were always near buildings or roads that later suffered some of the worst damage. Diana asked Dr. James Morrison, a geology professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage, to study the images. But his conclusion only deepened the mystery. He told her the patterns could not have been created by any known natural process. Their sharp precision and timing were too perfect. If these shapes had truly formed before the earthquake, he said, they would be a type of pre-quake warning signal that had never been seen before. But the strange ground markings were not the only disturbing discovery. As Diana kept looking at photographs, she began noticing the same group of human figures appearing in multiple pictures, and their presence could not be explained. There were photographs taken by different people, in different towns, on different days, but all showed the same small group of people standing in the background. Diana explained that these people were always near the strange ground markings, watching or recording them. But when she tried to find out who they were through records or local directories, there was no trace of them. The same people appeared in pictures taken in Portage, Anchorage, Seward, and Valdez, towns separated by hundreds of miles of rough Alaskan wilderness. At that time in 1964, it would have been almost impossible for the same group to appear in all those places within just 2 weeks. The most unsettling part was that the figures seemed to know the earthquake was coming. In every picture, they were standing near areas that would later suffer the worst damage, and they looked as if they were measuring or observing something invisible to normal residents. Diana's search changed direction when she got a call from Margaret Jensen, an elderly woman from Palmer who had read about the exhibition in a newspaper. Margaret claimed she had information about the mysterious figures. She told Diana that her late husband, Carl Jensen, had been a surveyor for the Alaska Department of Transportation in 1964, and he had run into the same group of people while doing survey work. But they weren't part of any official project, and they were using equipment Carl had never seen before. Carl had written down his encounters in work journals, which Margaret had kept after his death in 1987. When Diana read the journals, she found entries that matched the photographs. On March 18, 1964, Carl had written, "Met the federal team again near mile 78 of the Seward Highway. They had some kind of ground equipment more advanced than anything we have. When I asked about their project, they showed me IDs from an agency I never heard of, the Geological Anomaly Research Division. They said it was classified work for national security and told me not to include them in my reports." His journals showed that the group had been moving around south-central Alaska for months, focusing only on places that later had the worst quake damage. They had machines for measuring ground vibrations, strange energy fields, and other things beyond normal survey tools in 1964. On March 24th, Carl noted that the team was at the Portage Flats, setting up a grid of equipment across most of the town. Their leader, a man who only called himself Doctor Coleman, told Carl they expected major geological activity within days. When Carl asked for details, Coleman said some things were classified but hinted that locals should prepare for evacuation. Carl's last entry about them was March 26th, just 1 day before the earthquake. He wrote, "Doctor, Coleman and his team packed up and left. He told me their work was done and that natural forces would take their course within 24 hours. He seemed to know exactly what would happen, but refused to explain, saying some things were too dangerous for civilians to know." Diana later asked the U.S. Geological Survey and other agencies about the Geological Anomaly Research Division, but no such group officially existed. When she asked for access to classified files from the 1960s, she was told many had been destroyed or were still secret. The only proof of their activities was the photographs in Carl's journals. The breakthrough came when Diana got a call from Dr. Richard Saunders, a retired seismologist who had worked for the Air Force in the 1960s. He said he had kept quiet for over 50 years, but felt she needed to know. He explained that the military had secretly been trying to predict earthquakes in Alaska since the late 1950s. Their research was part of a larger project to see if earthquakes could be predicted or even triggered by monitoring the Earth's magnetic and atmospheric signals. The Geological Anomaly Research Division had been a cover name for military scientists working on this project. The strange ground patterns Diana found in the photos were actually energy signals caused by hidden monitoring devices placed underground in quake-prone areas. Dr. Saunders explained that the military's technology could pick up early signals before a major quake. The teams were sent to places where their data predicted a coming earthquake. But the real shock came when Dr. Saunders revealed that the military had correctly predicted the March 27, 1964 earthquake 2 weeks before it happened. They had known almost exactly when and where it would hit and how strong it would be. But instead of warning anyone, they chose to keep it secret. The decision was made at the top military levels, out of fear that if the public knew earthquakes could be predicted, it would cause panic and also give enemies the idea of using earthquakes as weapons. Some scientists argued they should save lives, but officials decided secrecy was more important. Evidence was destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and photographs showing the survey teams were seized by government agents. Only a few pictures survived in private hands, which was why Diana had been able to find them at all. When deciding how to handle the exhibition, Diana faced a tough choice. The evidence suggested that the U.S. military had known about the 1964 disaster in advance, but let it happen. She consulted the Historical Society's board, but they warned her that accusing the government without absolute proof could bring lawsuits and funding cuts. In the end, she displayed the strange photographs but without detailed captions, letting visitors come to their own conclusions. At the same time, she wrote a long report about her findings and placed copies in different archives so the story would not be lost. The exhibition drew great public interest, but Diana noticed that some visitors seemed more focused than others. They took many notes and photos of the unusual images, but left quickly when she tried to speak to them. 2 weeks later, she got a call from someone claiming to be with the Department of Defense, who demanded she remove some photos from the show because they contained sensitive information. She refused, but soon after, her office was broken into 3 times, with only her earthquake research files stolen. She also got threatening calls telling her to stop digging into government matters. Eventually, the Historical Society's board voted to close the exhibition early and move the photographs into a restricted archive, saying they had received federal complaints and worried about their tax-exempt status. Diana knew the truth. She had found evidence of a cover-up, and powerful people were determined to keep it hidden. She left her job in 2015, but continued researching the ties between government earthquake programs and the 1964 Alaska quake. Her work has inspired others to look at signs before other big disasters. The photos she found showed the government had known the earthquake was coming, but did nothing. More than 130 people died because officials thought keeping military secrets was more important than saving lives. That choice turned Portage and other towns into ghost towns that might have been saved. The ruins of Portage still bring many visitors, who see only the tilted houses and dead forests left behind. But Diana's research shows that those ruins may also be proof of a government cover-up, one that let people die in order to protect classified programs. Music. Jake had over 50,000 followers on his wilderness blog. His posts from Prince of Wales Island were meant to show the wild beauty of Seer. Instead, they became a record of his last 72 hours. What started as normal hiking posts turned into a live record of supernatural terror that ended with Jake disappearing and proof that some abandoned mining towns are still guarded by something that never left. Jake Peterson had run his wilderness blog Alaska Untamed for 7 years when he chose to explore the ghost mining town of Zeer on Prince of Wales Island. At 32, he was an experienced backcountry hiker known for documenting forgotten Alaskan sites. He mixed striking photos with careful history, making his posts both exciting and educational. His followers loved how he told his stories through daily Instagram updates, Twitter posts, and longer blog entries, turning ghost towns into living stories through his adventures. When he said he would spend a week in Seir and the nearby mining areas, hundreds of followers shared their excitement. Day 1, March 8, 2023, Jake posted, "Made it to Seir after a brutal 8-hour hike from Hollis Ferry Terminal. This place is both amazing and isolated. The mining camp was abandoned in the 1940s, yet the buildings are still in surprisingly good shape after 80 years in the rainforest. Tomorrow I'll start documenting the main buildings and then climb higher to check the mining claims." Jake's first Instagram post from Seir showed the main lodge, a huge log building that had once worked as both headquarters and housing for the mine's managers. The picture caught the strange beauty of the place, with moss-covered logs and broken windows glowing in the dim forest light. But even in that very first post, some of Jake's followers saw something strange in the background. Behind the lodge, hidden between the trees, there looked to be a person standing still near one of the other mining buildings. Day 2, March 9th. Jake's blog began with him saying he woke up with the oddest sense that someone was watching him. He had camped about 100 yards from the settlement, but swore he heard sounds moving around the buildings through the night. He thought it was probably animals, though the way sound carried in the woods made it impossible to know where it came from. His Instagram that day showed detailed shots of old mining gear left behind when the workers left. Giant steam shovels, ore carts, and machinery sat where they had been dropped decades ago, like the people had just walked away mid-shift. But Jake noticed something odd. Some machines looked like they had been moved recently. Fresh marks in the soil showed something heavy had been dragged, and parts looked clean and oiled instead of rusted. "This gear is in way too good condition for 80 years in a rainforest," Jake posted on Twitter. "Either someone's maintaining it or the ghost stories are real. Starting to feel like I'm not alone." Followers warned him to leave, but he said he was probably just nervous, since remote places often played tricks on the mind. Day 3, March 10th. Jake's post grew more uneasy. He wrote that something about the place was wrong. The night before, he had heard machinery running, the exact sounds of mining gear working, with hissing steam, grinding metal, and ore crushers pounding. The next morning, he found fresh piles of waste rock and signs of machines recently in use. His Instagram showed pictures of these piles, but in the background of several shots were dark shapes of people, always near the gear, though never clear enough to make out. "Really bad vibes here," Jake tweeted. "Found a recent campsite near the mine office with new gear and food. Whoever was here left fast. Coffee still hot, fire still smoking. Maybe time to cut this short." But his audience pushed him to stay, fascinated by the unfolding mystery. His engagement exploded as thousands followed his story. Day 4, March 11th. Jake's words showed growing fear. He wrote, "I am not alone. There are people working the mines here, and they've been watching me." He saw moving lights at night, and that morning found fresh boot prints coming from his tent to the processing plant. Someone had walked right up to him as he slept. His Instagram showed more images, proving the mine was active. Machines running, new digs, or being processed,